participated recently in the Commission on Population and Development here at the Economic and Social Council, the ECOSOC, here at the United Nations. And it was interesting that one of the new approaches or new issues on the agenda of the Commission on Population and Development was population demographics and its connection with economic growth. Could you say something about that and what took place?
Yes, one of the key focuses of the Commission was the correlation between rates of fertility and economic growth. Evidence indicates that countries where fertility rates are declining, that in these countries they experience higher economic growth rates. This is not only connected with declines in fertility and declines in rates of mortality, but also this increase in economic growth is also associated with policies that promote education and job creation. So these three factors, decreases in fertility, decreases in mortality, and increases in the promotion of education and employment opportunities, have demonstrated enormous growth rates.
That's interesting because what I realized here in your report to President Fernandez, you mentioned that the countries you mentioned were China, Egypt, Ireland, Japan, Sweden, United States. My question is, although it may be true that these countries have diminished their mortality rates and diminished or decreased their fertility rates, but these are also countries that have invested significantly and placed a major emphasis policy-wise on science and technology, on innovation, on infrastructure. Ireland is a very global country. We know China has had increasing rates of economic growth for various different reasons. Was there any speakers or panelists or participants in this particular Commission on Population and Development that may have challenged the findings of this report, which make a correlation between mortality and fertility and economic growth, as opposed to other reasons for the growth of the economy?
Well, what delegates and civil society members echoed was that just declining rates of fertility and mortality alone are not sufficient for increasing economic growth. They all agreed that a great deal of emphasis needs to be placed on expanding the areas of science, technology, education, increasing these sectors. And one concern that was voiced by a number of delegates was concern that declines in fertility would eventually result in decreased economic growth if there's not a replacement level. So that was a concern that was voiced by many delegates, especially in countries that are experiencing very low rates of fertility. And that was an interesting topic that was brought up, because now for the first time in history, in many countries, the population of people over the age of 60 has surpassed the amount of individuals of working age. So the issues that were brought up were, essentially, what are the implications of this on economic growth? Does this mean that economies are going to decline because the working population has diminished? Will that put extra stress on both families and government? And so essentially the response of experts was that whether or not an economy experiences economic decline because of this is going to be based on systems of social security as well as the individual's own savings. If the individual has collected large amount of earnings over time, then in turn they will contribute to economic growth as opposed to hindering it. So that was interesting.
Well, I think we can absolutely continue this dialogue, but to close, I'd like to solicit your opinion. One, I think that, and I know that probably it would be prudent for more cost-benefit analysis, quantitative analysis to be done. If you take a look at the United States, for example, versus the Dominican Republic, let's say, the United States has to prepare for the baby boomers. Increasingly, as you say, the burgeoning population of seniors over the age of 60. And the family or the government who has to more or less assume the care of this population. So that's on one hand, that is an important issue for our development and financing and the amount of resources that population consumes. But two, I think economic growth, and this is probably a question that we can close with, economic growth has become a politically, I would say, attractive issue for governments. In reading your report, I wasn't here, you were here during the session, but reading your report, I think this was a very advantageous moment for those who are experts or activists in the area of population to use this as an opportunity to say, hey, you governments, you come in for 4 years, maybe 8 years, you want to promote economic growth, you want to build your economies, you want to create jobs, well, control fertility rates. And this correlation that is being made maybe needs to be flushed out a little bit more. Maybe more dialogue needs to take place.
Well, that was the consensus as well, because this third stage of what is described as the demographic dividend, it's the first time that this is taking place in the course of history, that you have all these populations with a large percentage of their society over the age of 60. So the implications of these demographic changes on economic growth remain to be seen. However, what is speculated is that over time, in the third stage, which is classified by low rates of fertility and a larger population of people over 60, is that what is going to happen is economic growth will plateau to a greater degree. You won't see that initial increase that takes place between the first stage and the second stage, which is defined by decreases in rates of fertility and decreases in rates of mortality. So essentially what was emphasized is that developing countries can gain this boost in terms of economic development, coupled with programs that focus on education, job creation, and capacity building. They can gain this extra.
But it's not the only thing.
No, that's not the only thing.
And it's basically a contribution.
Right, it's a contribution to other efforts.
So the big question becomes, what is the size of that contribution to economic growth? And I would assume it would depend on many different variables, including the size of the economy. Maybe controlling fertility rates in China is a bit different than controlling fertility rates in the Dominican Republic, and what it means for each country's economic growth over the short term, over the medium term, and over the long term. But this is very interesting, and I think it's something that we here at FUNGLODE and GFTD should continue to stay abreast of and continue with this dialogue and analysis of this important issue. I think it's very interesting that economic growth has been brought into the realm of population and development. So, thanks, Kerry.
Thanks, John.